Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Welcome. Today's webinar is about program development for the NCAI Fund's Victim Services Microgrant Program. And the webinar is co-hosted by the National Congress of American Indians Fund, the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and the First Republic Incorporated. My name is Esther Labrado, and I'm an enrolled citizen of the Norfolk Rancheria of Mono Indians and a descendant of the Morongo Band of Mission Indians, and I'm a staff attorney at NCAI. I want to thank you all for joining, and before we begin, we'll go ahead and go over some housekeeping tips and let you know how you can participate in today's webinar. So on your screen, you should see the viewer window, and that's where your PowerPoint is displayed, and then on the right side of your screen is the control panel, and it looks like the image on the PowerPoint, although if you can't see it, just look for the small orange arrow. And if you click on that, it will open and close the control panel. At the top of the control panel are your audio controls, and we recommend calling in using your telephone as it provides the best audio connection. And to do so, you'll actually need to select the little button next to telephone, and that'll display the phone number and audio pin that you'll need to call in. Below that is a questions box, and you can go ahead and type your questions throughout today's webinar. We'll be monitoring that box, and we will also leave some time for questions at the end. So you can either type your questions into that questions box, or there's a little icon under that orange arrow that has an image of a hand with an arrow. And if you click on that, it will be able to unmute your line, and you can ask your question verbally. Today's webinar is being recorded, and after the webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to a short evaluation, and then this webinar will be made available online at www.tribalvictimservices.org. Great. Next slide. Thank you. So thank you again for joining us. As I mentioned, today's webinar is about program development for the National Congress of American Indians Fund Victim Services Microgrant Program. And today we'll go over and provide an overview of ideas, tools, and resources to help you develop your application for this victim services funding opportunity. And joining us today are Lana Hunter, Tribal Victim Resource Specialist at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and Kelly Crow, Project Director at First Republic Incorporated. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I wanted to provide, again, a quick overview of the application process. If you are familiar with, or if you've seen some of our other webinars, these slides will look very familiar to you. So hopefully everyone knows, the step one of the process is completing the statement of interest. And that was due Friday, June 26th. If anyone is on the webinar and has not yet been able to submit their statement of interest, please email us at microgrants@ncai.org. But I believe all of you are joining us today because you have been invited to step two, which is due Friday, August 21st. So you should all have received an email on Monday, July 13th, and that explains the process for the step two final application. And you separately would have received a login email to go ahead and set up your account to complete the application. And we're more than happy to answer any questions if you had any issues with that process. Just as a reminder, step two requires a summary project proposal and a summary budget. And the Tribal Law and Policy Institute is available throughout this whole process to provide technical assistance to anyone who needs it. Next slide, please. Great, and here's kind of another representation, a more visual representation of that process. As you can see, the step one piece has been grayed out slightly, and we're now into step two. So again, your deadline for submitting this application is August 21st. And we will then conduct an initial review for viability proposal, geographic distribution, and risk of noncompliance with federal statutes. And as I mentioned, the final application requires a summary budget. So once you've submitted your application and we reviewed it, you'll get notification that you have been given an award and you'll complete your budget development process. And that will happen before you actually sign your award documents and before it's complete. So once you move through that process, and again, you'll receive assistance if you would like it in order to complete that detailed budget process. We'll then review that, conduct any follow-up and ask any additional questions, and then you'll be actually receiving your award and starting your project process by October. And again, we're happy to answer any questions, but with that, I will turn it over to Lana Hunter. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. My name is Lana Hunter, and I'm from the Tlingit Nation in Southeast Alaska, as well as the Sisseton Wakbetawan, the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate Nation in Sisseton, South Dakota. I work for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, specifically with tribes working on behalf of victims. And this has been my passion for 25 years. And we're happy that we're able to join the National Congress of American Indians, as well as First Pick, Inc., to provide this opportunity for funding for victim services, because it is definitely needed in our nations as we respond to the needs of victims, the types of services for victims, the populations of victims that we serve, and especially now coming out of this time of COVID-19, where many of our tribes had to pull back funding from different types of services within their tribal programs, either due to the pandemic itself or losing revenue within their casinos. So I think this is a timely opportunity for the tribes that are able to join us for this funding opportunity. And again, thank you to NCAI for taking on this role and believing so much that victims need these services right in our tribal communities. So as we move through the slides, I'm going to be working with my counterpart, Kelly Crow, and we're going to be providing you an overview of the Step 2 final application. And Kelly is going to provide an opportunity to look at the online portal if you have not been able to log on yet. And I will be providing you information specifically as you're developing your full RFP. And for folks who have never had victim services in their communities, just some points and tips for you to consider as you're putting together your proposal and working with victims. This is an area I think that is unlike any other population in our tribal communities. And there's a number of reasons for that I'll get into. But the next few slides, I would like to provide at least an overview of some of the points that you're going to have to put together for Step 2, as well as talk through some of the benefits for community needs assessment and or strategic planning, or both. And then we'll get into some of the specifics around program development. So as you move through Step 2 of the application, you'll see that there is some specific documentation that you'll need to provide. This specifically is speaking to those folks who are applying as a consortium or designee. I think there are a few of you out there who are either coalition, intertribal coalition, and or consortium. This is just saying that we will be requiring that documentation. So as you're planning forward today, a month from today, the full RFP will be due. So what are the steps you need to do to get that documentation if you are a consortium or designee? Next slide. So these are some of the questions that specifically Kelly will be going over from First Pick, but these are some of the points also that as you're putting together and planning for victim services and or expanding victim services, or you're funding existing services, we wanted you to be able to consider. So there are specific issues in your community that are happening. This is asking for what the specific issue is. And again, everything has to be victim-centered. Through the Office of Victims of Crime or Department of Justice when we're specifically working with victims. So this is an opportunity for you to tell us what the issue that you're seeing in your community, how you plan to address that issue, and what population that you're going to be serving. And so when we look at the populations and the opportunities that we have to either expand on the current services, victim services we have, for example, if you're working with now victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, you have an opportunity to expand services to provide elderly victim assistance opportunities and or youth. Right now, I think it's important to understand what that capacity is that you currently have. And then what are those activities that you will be providing for that population, as well as that specific programming. Next slide. So as we get into, I won't go into too much detail with this because there are some specifics, but for folks who stated in their statement of interest that they are planning on providing either to the community a community needs assessment and or strategic planning. These are specific questions that we are asking in Step 2 application to understand what that looks like. Next slide. And I wanted to talk about the benefits of a community needs assessment. So we see that if you have applied for any other type of funding in the past, there may be opportunities for you to provide a community needs assessment within your community and or provide an opportunity for systems to implement, to provide and implement strategic planning. But specifically for victim services, I wanted to talk about the benefits of a community needs assessment if you have never had a victim service program, or if you have an existing program, or if you're expanding the services within a specific population. Say you're moving into sex trafficking, or you're providing an opportunity for those who have been stalked, either through electronic, multi-jurisdictions. So this is really an opportunity for you to know without a shadow of a doubt the specific area that you're working within. And so some of the issues that when we're working with victims, we want to understand are the gaps in services, the gaps in safety. Where are we meeting the needs of victims? Where are we not meeting the needs of victims? And understanding how those gaps in safety provide either a loophole or they are not holding offenders accountable, are our interagency coordinating communication, and that can be either through multi-jurisdictions. How are we working cohesively together? And this is really community needs assessment that can speak to those specific issues. And we have the information as well as almost the data to back up the direction that we are moving towards. And this, can be through either providing that community needs assessment to victims themselves, to understand what they've experienced within our criminal justice, either tribal criminal justice, federal or state jurisdictions, and to address those gaps as a result of the community needs assessment. And this is also to clarify the roles when responding to victims of domestic violence, stalking, child abuse, which can include child sexual abuse, child physical abuse reports, sex trafficking reports. So this really provides us the opportunity to go back to evaluate our current roles within existing victim services, or to develop the opportunity to respond as separate jurisdictions coming together, or within a tribal criminal justice response. This also addresses offender accountability. So where is our tribal communities not, if they're holding the offender accountable at mandatory arrest, if they violate a civil order of tribal order of protection, do we have probation or another way to follow up with that offender to hold them accountable for violating that protection of order? So we're really looking at specifics of where either victims, again, you can provide the community needs assessment to victims directly, or you can provide the community needs assessment to the jurisdictions working within that tribal, federal, state jurisdictional response, or this can be within your own tribal systems. How is ICW or Indian Child Welfare working together with victim services, working together with police reports? How are we and where are we interviewing victims? Is it a safe location? Is it a confidential location? So we're really trying to address those gaps in safety. And this allows victims to trust our tribal criminal justice systems. It allows for them to come forward. It addresses their concerns about confidentiality, privacy, specific safety needs. Perhaps you know that within your tribal system, there are no opportunities for housing. So what does that look like as we're moving forward? And what are those specifics? Maybe it has to do with transitional housing. Maybe they would like the opportunity to be able to not live in a shelter, but live somewhere long-term. And perhaps that's transitional housing that would get them to the safety that they need for long-term housing. And also understanding what responses that you have to victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, in terms of either racism, insensitive treatment of victims. Perhaps there's, culturally inappropriate responses within a shelter, local county shelter. And these are really opportunities for us to provide specific asks of either our victims that we're answering the needs assessment, our tribal justice systems, or our multi-jurisdictional agencies. Next slide. And as we're putting together our community needs assessment, it naturally moves into the opportunity for strategic planning. And, this specifically speaks to what are those roles, what are those specific issues that we are going to address that we've uncovered through the community needs assessment. And this is just an example of one of the, specific goals, activities that would come out of strategic planning. So say you've done the community needs assessment, you have an inventory now of those existing services. You've provided the victim experience survey and conducted that community needs assessment. This is an opportunity now to write a protocol, and that can be either codes, interagency agreements. It can be specifically talking about addressing the lack of education. One of the benefits of providing victim services from a tribal victim-centered standpoint is that we really are in the driver's seat to be able to provide those agencies whether they're state agencies, county agencies, or even within our own tribal agencies, the opportunity for education to understand the needs of victims. And so this is really that opportunity to provide even community education. Oftentimes we see that there's perhaps victim blaming within our communities, within specific populations, say that there are victims of sex trafficking. You know, folks may see that as either they've chose that way of life, they're engaged in prostitution. What they may not understand is that, you know, there may be an underlying factor for them to, that they are concerned for their own safety. They've been coerced into that. They're dealing with substance use disorder. And so there are a number of opportunities for us to provide training that would allow for specific responses that are not victim blaming, rather victim centered. And then this also gives us the chance to monitor, is this working for victims? Is this, you know, interagency agreement with our local sheriff, you know, working out? Are they, you know, treating our victims respectfully? Is there the opportunity to monitor phone calls when an offender is incarcerated? Maybe he's calling the victims from jail. So this is really that chance to monitor the changes, the mechanisms, the victim-centered responses that we put in place. And that provides us the opportunity for evaluation, which could lead to additional funding opportunities within the Department of Justice, within other state agencies, or federal or nonprofit agencies. Next slide, please. So again, these are specific questions that will be asked in step 2, and I won't go over them in depth, but these are opportunities for you to explain the how the equipment, supplies, and specifically, I think, talking through procurement, what that looks like. And Kelly, my colleague, will talk specifically more about that. But again, if you are asking for equipment or supplies, they need to be directly tied to how they're serving victims. So if you are requesting a vehicle, how are you, you know, transporting victims? What does that look like in terms of documentation? So really kind of thinking through how this goes back and we're able to tell a story about how this is victim-centered. And so this will be in step 2 of the application, and understanding that this is also a very short term, if you think about in the grant process, the grant period is from October 1st, 2020 through June 30, 2022. So I think that there is consideration as we're putting together our proposals, what is realistically going to be funded within this grant period, what can we accomplish, and really what is the outcome, what is the best possible outcome for victims that we can arrive at the end of this grant period. So I think this is really that opportunity to really think that through. And as you're putting together your proposal, I think it is helpful to, if you have not, if you work within behavioral health, have you talked with victim services? Have you talked with the tribal court systems? This is really that opportunity to coordinate a number of agencies to come together to realistically address the gaps or expand on current victim services, or to fund existing services that you already have. And what is the capacity that you have to address those specific issues for victims or populations? So I think just as you're putting together this plan from now until when the full RFP is due on August 21st, really having those thoughts and considerations. Is it victim-centered? What other agencies within our tribal justice system can we work with? And even expanding that outside of that area. If you're an ICW program applying for funding, are you working with other agencies within your tribal justice systems? Is this the best possible outcome? Because if you're not doing a community needs assessment, how are we arriving at the needs of victims? Is that an informed, victim-informed response? And if that is just within one tribal justice system or one tribal agency within your tribe, how are we pulling together other folks to arrive at a victim-centered response that's as informed as possible? I will turn it over to Esther to see if there's any questions, and then Kelly, my colleague, will do the next couple of slides.
Great, thank you. There aren't any questions at this time, but just as a reminder, on your control panel, so it may have minimized at this point, so look for the small orange arrow. But if you click on that, there is a questions/chat box. And you can go ahead and type in your question there. Or if you would like to ask your question verbally, you can click on the icon underneath that orange arrow with the little hand and the arrow on it. But no questions at this time, and I'll turn it back over to Kelly. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Esther and Lana. My name is Kelly Crow. I am a project director with First Pick Inc., and we have partnered with TLPI and NCAI to provide you some training and technical assistance around the compliance, financial management, and performance outcomes management for this grant. So our goal throughout both the application process and then through the actual grant is to be a partner to you all as applicants and grantees to make sure that you understand exactly what is expected going into participating in this federally funded grant process, and then to support you as you go through and try to understand how you need to submit certain documentation in order to make sure that you're receiving your payments on time, and to make sure that you're able to submit your performance measurement data on time as well. So throughout this presentation, I'll be sharing a little bit with you about some of the compliance requirements that have to do with creating your budget. And as we move forward throughout the process, you'll also be hearing from me and my colleagues as we get into the process for using the online reporting system and eventually submitting your financial documentation and your programmatic documentation. So that's just a little overview of First Pick's role in this project. We're super excited to be working with you all. And I think that my overwhelming message for everybody is to use us as a resource as you go into this. We are here to kind of be your guide and to be your support. We know that federal funding can be overwhelming, it can be daunting, there's a lot of rules, and it can feel like there's a lot at stake. And so we are 100% here to support you and make sure that everything that you provide is in line, is appropriate. And so if you need help before you're submitting, as you're submitting, if you have questions as you're putting together the application, please do not hesitate to reach out. We want to be as much of a help to you as possible before things get submitted so that you don't have to worry that something has been done inaccurately. So to that end, one of the things that we're asking people to think about at this step in the application process is if you're going to use a contractor or provide a subaward through your grant. You might use a contractor for personnel that are not staffed. So if you're going to contract with local mental health services, if you're planning to bring on a victim advocate, but they are not going to be an employee of the tribe or of the consortium, but instead you're going to contract with them as like a 1099 employee, then we need you to be thinking about what the requirements are around contracting. In the same way, if you're going to provide a subaward through this, if there is a mental health facility or behavioral health facility and you're going to subaward portion of your grant to that organization in order for them to provide support Both of those circumstances fall under the compliance requirements for what we call the Uniform Guidance, or 2 CFR 200. And this allows that the funds can be used to contract or subaward through this in order to achieve the goals of the victim services activity. There's been some changes to this recently, so what I want to share right now is that whether or not you're contracting or subawarding has less to do with the mechanism by which you are engaging with the entity, whether it's a contract or an MOU is not as important as what they are going to be doing. If you're contracting with somebody, they're providing a service, cell phone technology, software for your, or maybe a subscription to a virus protection for the laptops that you purchased or something like that. Or they may be providing another service for you that is kind of a direct service towards, I'm trying to figure out the best way to explain this because it gets confusing, but it's not material to the program being implemented. If you're going to engage in a contract or a subaward with any entity that is conducting activities that are integral in terms of making sure that the outcomes of your award are enacted, then that is considered by DOJ as a subaward. So for the purposes of the explanations that I gave before in terms of if you are engaging with a 1099 employer to be your victim advocate, you actually need to talk with us to determine whether or not that's actually going to be considered a contract under this, or if it's going to be considered a subaward depending on the services that they're going to provide. Likewise, if you're planning to pass money through to another entity, they've gotten kind of specific on this as to whether or not it's a subaward or a contract. And the whole point of me sharing this is just if you think that you're going to engage an outside entity through either a contract or a subaward, we ask that you mention that to TLPI during the process of developing your application so that we have some time to work with you, ensure that you're making the right decisions around whether or not you're doing it through a contract or a subaward, and to make sure that you're putting in place adequate procurement and monitoring procedure so that you don't have to try to do that on the back end. Go ahead and go to the next slide. In the application process, one of the things that we're asking about are the capabilities and competencies of the entity that's applying. A couple questions that are going to be asked on the application that we ask you to think through is who's going to be responsible for the day-to-day implementation of the grant? So programmatically, who is actually going to be in charge of making sure that the outcomes that have been expressed are going to be maintained? Oh, you were on the right slide before. Yeah, that's right. And then also, who's going to be responsible for the financial management, procurement, and reporting? We think that it's really important that these people all come together if they're not the same person, so that the person who's responsible for procurement of materials and services and equipment, as well as the person who's responsible for reporting, speaks regularly to the person who's responsible for implementation of the grant from day one, so that you can make sure that you have the capability to purchase all of your items on time, that you understand how long the procurement process is for your tribe, so that if you are putting together a project plan that requires that you have a certain piece of equipment by a certain time, that you've been able to work with the procurement officers at your tribe well enough in advance to have that. And so we just encourage that you not only think about including that in your application, but start engaging those individuals in this process as you're talking to TLPI about what your plans are, that you're engaging all those who are going to be responsible for both financial management and reporting. As part of this project, you're going to have to collect some performance measurement data for us to be able to share with OVC. Some of the specific data that's going to be required will be the number of individuals receiving services, the demographics of recipients, the types of victimization, the number of requests that you receive for services. We're going to ask you what you need in order to collect and report data. So thinking through, do you have the laptops? Do you have the staff on hand? Do you have the confidentiality process in place to make sure that the data that is reported on victims can be kept confidential? That can be something as simple as locked cabinets to keep the files in so that nobody can have access to. Think about all those things so that you can include all of those in your budget. And then thinking through, do you have any current challenges on collecting and reporting data? When we're asking this question, it's really so that we can help you try and identify how to overcome those challenges in the future, not necessarily to mark you down on the application or anything, but more so that we can think from a technical assistance perspective what your needs may be. If you have inconsistent internet access and so you're concerned about being able to submit reports on time, it's important for us to know that now so that we can work to make sure that we can provide you an alternative form of reporting so that you're not reliant on driving into another town to submit your report. So those are the reasons why we're asking these questions, is really so that we can provide you the best support possible and make sure that anything that you might need in order to help you, you can include in your budget.
Kelly, we have one question which goes back a little bit. So the question is, it goes back to the contract versus consultant question. So the question is, if we hire someone to assist with a needs assessment and with strategic planning, is that considered a subaward or a contract?
I really recommend that folks communicate that to TLPI and let's talk through it with you. For the purposes of the budget that you're putting together, the contract and subaward is the same category, so it won't make a difference for right now. But we need to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of exactly what role they're going to play. It sounds like just basically if they're going to be providing you that support, they would be a subawardee based on what OJP has been recommending. But I'd have to understand a little bit more details about exactly what they're doing in order to say that definitively.
Great, thank you. And we don't have any other questions, but I just want to mention something that I had neglected to mention earlier. So additionally, in your control panel, there is a handout section, and we do have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and a few additional handouts, which we'll be referencing later in the webinar. So I wanted to direct everyone's attention there. And then also just to say that this webinar, as others have mentioned, this is a lot of information, and this webinar is being recorded and will be available online later to review again. And then additionally, just please feel free to reach out to the Tribal Law and Policy Institute with any additional questions. We want to help you through this process as much as possible. Great, and I'll turn it back over to Kelly or Lana.
Kelly?
Great. Lana, go ahead. I think that you're going to do the next slide.
Yeah, I just wanted to see if there were any additional that you wanted to follow up with before I went on to the next.
Nope, that's all.
Great. Next slide. So I think specifically to address the questions and Kelly's response around the strategic plan and or needs assessment should be considered a subaward or a contract. And Kelly mentioned that the Tribal Law and Policy Institute will be contacting folks. So the exciting process with working with the National Congress of American Indians and responding to the needs of tribes is really this opportunity for NCAI to put in place this mechanism for technical assistance. And so that is the role of the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, as well as First Pick. So NCAI heard tribes loud and clear and said, you know, what are the opportunities that we can provide through this funding opportunity, not just to throw an RFP out there, but really to work with tribes to understand the needs of tribes as well as the capacity and to respond to those. And so having said that, the Tribal Law and Policy Institute has begun contacting all of the tribes who have applied. So if you have not heard from us, it's only been our, I believe, second, so the second day into our second week, we are contacting tribes. So I will one of my colleagues from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute will be contacting you individually, or if you want to reach out to us firsthand to ask more specific questions as you're putting together the full RFP and or budget process, working with First Pick, we are available. And again, it's an exciting opportunity, and thank you to NCAI for thinking of our tribes, for thinking of our tribes' needs in a way to put together a federal funding proposal that's not complicated, not convoluted, but really responding to the needs of tribes. So having said that, as important, I believe, as the financial policies, capabilities, is really to understand putting together our crime victim programs within our tribal communities. And I mentioned some of the concerns within the community needs assessment and or strategic planning slides, but I really wanted to touch on some imperative safety needs. And this is unlike any other population that we are working with within our tribal communities. This is not our USDA food program. This is not the kind of standard maybe environmental responses or concerns. This is really the need to consider the lives of and safety of our tribal citizens. And so for that reason, safety is the most important concern. And so as we're putting together these proposals, we want to understand, what does that look like, not just for victims, but for our tribal systems. So tribal judges, tribal courts, tribal law enforcement, maybe it's county law enforcement, maybe it's federal law enforcement, hospital staff, social services, and or ICW, and others who work towards victim safety and offender accountability. So this is the only time, as we're working within our tribal systems, that we are really thinking not just of responding to the needs of victims and offender accountability, but really thinking long-term about how we are going to arrive at safety and address potentially the capacity that we have to respond to those needs. And if we do not have the existing capacity, what additional capacity do we need to implement either through this funding opportunity and or community needs assessment, strategic planning, any of those other processes in place that we are really being informed at a victim-centered response, and we are responding to the needs of victims. So if for that reason, I always suggest, as we're developing new programs, even if we're expanding on existing services and programming, it's important to work with the crime victim advocates or victim advocates within your tribal community. And if you are a new program and do not have victim advocates, who are those other systems within your tribal systems, justice systems that understand the need of victims? Because this is one population where, as possibly as behavioral health, for example, they may have an idea about the needs of victims that is maybe separate from the ICW program, who may have an idea of the needs of victims. What we are really trying to understand are the needs of victims and understanding those gaps for safety, understanding where we are filling those gaps within our tribal justice systems, and or if it involves other multi-jurisdictions, how are we really understanding the needs of victims firsthand is the best possible way. And again, that's possibly a community needs assessment, if not those specific victim advocates who are working with victims, because oftentimes they will let them know, that there is a need for shelter, a need for transportation, a need for phone minutes. Some of our areas are very rural, and oftentimes victims may not have, phone minutes to make those phone calls to find additional housing. And so how are we responding to the needs of victims and or their children? And if we're working with specific child sexual abuse or child physical abuse reports within our ICW programs, what are the needs of victims within that system? And so we're looking at responding to those needs from kind of the boots on the ground, which are our victim advocates. And if we're developing a victim advocate program, that we're really understanding the need for training to be trained as a victim advocate. If it's a victim advocate that's located in a law enforcement agency, how is that different than a victim advocate who works for a nonprofit agency, who works for a shelter program, and understanding that there are specific outcomes. And so confidentiality is always a consideration. So we want to, as you're putting together the full RFP, really understand what the opportunities that you have to address the needs of victims from the perspective of the victims. And that is really that victim-centered approach, and to address the needs in a way that we have the capacity to do so, or we are building the capacity to do so, or this funding is meeting the needs of the capacity to address victim-centered safety and needs, as well as offender accountability. Next slide. So what does that look like? It looks like the opportunity to be trauma-informed. And again, I know that this has been kind of one of those buzzwords that we've thrown around, has been the trauma-informed approach. But really, as we're working with victims who have experienced violence, who have experienced maybe they're a child of sexual abuse survivor, how are we understanding the needs of survivors within our communities? And so really to take that larger approach and understand that historical trauma, as well as childhood trauma, or if folks have heard of adverse childhood experiences, those specific traumas that have affected them throughout their lifetime, and what adverse effects have they had on either their health, their spirit, how are they affected physically, mentally, emotionally? How are we really meeting the needs of victims, but also understanding that this is not just a one-time incident that has occurred. This may have been occurring throughout their lifetime, and or considering the needs and understanding of the historical trauma that we have experienced within our tribal communities. And so taking into consideration all of those factors as we are addressing the needs of victims. The other opportunity is for cross-training, and perhaps, this is something that we understand from, the capacity response. If we are providing new services for victims, this may not be the time to provide cross-training within multi-jurisdictional criminal justice systems, but perhaps this is something that as you move forward through this first year of your victim services, maybe this is something that you can look long-term about how to bring together those cross-trainings for the multi-jurisdictional criminal justice systems. And again, this is really victim-centered. This is not just to train law enforcement. This is to train any of those systems who touch the lives of victims. And so only you know what that looks like within your tribal community. And then understanding how our tribal justice systems are working together for offender accountability. And again, these are tribally focused, so this is not within an existing multidisciplinary team. We really want this to to come from our tribal justice systems in a sovereignty and safety approach to address offender accountability and to address victim safety. And so there are some examples that I have put up here. So there's a tribally led coordinated community response team. And again, the CCR teams are one of the longer term, over the past 30 years, developed within programs of domestic violence within the mainstream society. But we really have this opportunity to have a tribally led CCR. And this is really the example of a multidisciplinary team or an MDT that is specific to responding to the needs of victims. So, for example, at the table, you could have, law enforcement, tribal law enforcement, you could have a tribal court system, you could have the victim advocate program, you could have the ICW program, whatever that looks like within your tribal communities, and or the opportunity for a tribal sexual assault response team. And these are SARTs, right? So these are going to be focused on the prosecution and outcome for victims of sexual assault within our tribal communities. And so this is that opportunity to have a tribally led sexual assault response team that's focused on what we need to do to be able to allow for victims to move through a rape exam within the hospital or reporting into a rape exam at the local IHS or the closest hospital that has a sexual assault nurse examiner. So this is really that opportunity for us to define what that can look like for victims of sexual assault and coordinating those responses so that we can allow for, if the victim chooses to move forward with the prosecution, that we're understanding what that system, criminal justice system, looks like, so that we're working with the victim every step of the way, that we're providing that advocacy, where we're being good relatives and providing the follow-up. So these are the opportunities for capacity, and maybe these are things that are long-term down the road as you really establish your victim service program. These are things to look forward to understand that these are our systems responses that we as a tribe want to ensure are in place for our victims. And maybe it's not within this grant period, perhaps it's 2 to 3 years down the road. Next slide. So as you're putting together your full RFP, these are just some examples of what we can provide, what the funding can be used for. So I won't read through all of them specifically. I will just mention the traditional cultural or alternative therapy. So this really speaks to victim rights. Victims have rights within their within tribes, communities, states, federal responses and or agencies. And so that is really to ensure that we can return them to whole as possible. And knowing that, some of the most deepest spiritual wounds come from victimization. And so they may not be able to be returned to whole, without that healing process in place. And so what are those opportunities that we can provide as a sovereign tribe that is not state, not federal, but really are those ceremonies, are those safe spiritual leaders in place? What do we know within our cultural stories and or language to really meet the needs of victims at that spiritual level? Because again, understanding that victimization is the deepest spiritual wound that you will ever experience. And so it's not just surface level, it's not just a physical healing process, it's not just a mental, but that we are really thinking holistically within our tribal sovereignty about returning a victim to whole through those spiritual, cultural ways of knowing that we have within our tribal communities. Next slide, please. Sorry, can you go back to that slide, Abby? So I did not point out, so if you have not viewed the list of the allowable and unallowable costs, you can download that with this link. And so this is really speaking to those specifics of what you can and cannot apply for under this fund. Next slide. So these are some of the examples of what funding can be used for. I won't go through the list, but these are specifics that will, and again, all of them have to be victim-centered. So ensuring that you're really writing that within your RFP about how this is meeting the needs of victims, how you're responding to those needs of victims. Next slide. And what is unallowable? So this is just a brief list of what is not allowable under this NCAI microgrant. So anything to do with law enforcement and prosecution. However, if you have a victim witness advocate who works within law enforcement or who happens to be a law enforcement officer who is working on behalf of victims and responding to the needs of victims, that really has to be laid out within your RFP. Because this fund cannot be used for law enforcement and or prosecution. Anything to do with prevention, anything that speaks about prevention, that talks to prevention, this is not allowable under this fund. Any services for offenders, so no batterers, offenders, intervention programming, construction or purchasing of real estate, lobbying, fundraising, grant writing, and again, that list of those allowable and unallowable are provided there for your opportunity to view as you're putting together your full RFP. So I am going to turn it over to Kelly to talk a little bit about the budget process of all of our programming.
Great, thank you, Lana. And I know we're just coming up on the 2 o'clock hour. So again, I want to remind everybody that if you do have to jump off, that we are recording the webinar and that there are handouts available with the PDF slides of this. But we'll definitely try to move through a little quickly so we don't keep people too long. Some of the things to be considering, one of the first things to be considering is that this is a summary budget. We're only asking for your budget amounts by category. We're asking you to give us some detail about how you got there, but after awards are made, you'll be working with First Pick to develop your full budget. You definitely have the opportunity to make changes between now and then. So this is kind of your best guess. We would recommend that you put together what you think, do cursory internet research for any supplies that you might be purchasing, but don't feel like you need to have the exact dollar amounts on anything right at this point, because you will have time to create a more detailed budget. Some of the specific things that you should be thinking about is how many staff are you going to include in the project? Are they going to be full-time or part-time? Are they hourly or salaried? And are they going to be committing 100% of their time or only a portion of their time to the grant? You are allowed to apply a percentage of their fringe benefits. If they are 100% on the grant, you can apply 100% of their fringe benefits to the grant. If they're 50%, you can apply 50% and so on. We ask you to make sure to check with your payroll system, determine what payroll taxes you're required to pay, because you can also include a portion of those to be covered by the grant. And again, the portion is just whatever percentage of time they are going to be on the grant. And then thinking about any travel, we particularly ask people to think about for victim services, if you are going to be transporting victims to different services, support services, making sure that you're taking into account what that might be. If you're going to be pulling together community members to provide needs assessments or to get input from others, making sure that you think about what the transportation costs associated with some of these things are. One thing that you cannot apply is for an individual to go from their home to the place of business to their office, but anytime that a staff person moves from their office to anything related to the grant, you are going to be able to apply that to your grant. Either if they're using their personal vehicle, they can be reimbursed at the federal mileage rate, which we've included here. And we're going to provide you with a mileage log so that you can record that. But we want to make sure that you think through just kind of all the additional things that might be included in this so that you are recouping all of the costs associated with implementing this grant. Next slide. We want you to think about the auxiliary equipment and supplies that are needed. I mentioned things like locked cabinets for files. If you're going to be purchasing computers or laptops, be thinking about what kind of software you might need, virus protection, Microsoft Office Suite, those kinds of things. Those are all going to have costs to them that we want to make sure that you're able to have covered within the grant. Think about any service contracts. So if you're going to get cell phones, make sure that you put in your budget that you're going to include the service contract, internet, virtual platforms. If you're going to be doing webinars or online virtual engagement, are you going to need to have some sort of subscription in order to do that? If these services are going to be shared across the grant and other areas, then you can just apply for, a percentage of it. So if 50% of an individual's time is on the grant, then you can put 50% of the cell phone contract on the grant. But again, we can work with you on the specifics. For right now, you can just use those as parameters. One of the things that Lana spoke to that I think you need to take into consideration is that this grant allows for you to purchase emergency needs for victims, including clothing, transportation, toiletries, and small amounts of food and snacks, because we know that under emergency circumstances, you essentially need to be able to provide victims with whatever it is that they might need. So think about those things. Think about, if you're planning to predominantly do transportation of individuals to services and you find they don't have clothes to appear in court, are you going to want to make sure that you're able to purchase a set of clothing for them that will make them feel comfortable appearing in court? Again, TLPI can help you with some of those details of what if this happens, what if that happens, and then First Pick can help you figure out, how to include that in your budget. But I would recommend that for the most part, people include some sort of budget line item for emergency needs for victims, because you probably will be using those at some point in time.
Kelly, we have a quick question.
Okay.
Sorry, pause just real quick. So if advocates are on call for crisis calls, can the grant pay mileage from their home if calls come in at night or during weekends? As you mentioned, mileage can't cover from your home, but what if it's a crisis call that's sort of outside of work hours?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the rule of thumb tends to be that you do the lesser of the mileage. So if I were to move from my home to the point of where the individual is, if my office space, quote unquote, is closer to where I met the victim than my home, then I'd essentially get reimbursed for the distance from the office to the location where I met the victim. But in some circumstances, and we'll talk through this with you as you go into reimbursements, in the case where it's, the middle of the night or, like you said, the weekend, we will actually make an exception so that the mileage would be directly from your home. What we're just going to ask is that in the mileage log, you note the time of day or the date so that we can reference the fact that there's no reason why you would have been going from your home. So for general purposes, if you are home and it's like middle of the day and it's a work day, we're going to ask you to go ahead and just ask for the reimbursement from the office to the site that you met them. But if it is an evening or a weekend outside of normal operating hours, then we would be able to provide you the reimbursement for your home to where you actually went.
Great, thank you. No other questions at this time.
Next slide. I'm going to hand this over to Lana to speak to the scenarios that we have and how you can use those to best put together your Step 2 application.
Thank you, Kelly. So I think, we covered a majority of the questions that are highlighted at the very top, as well as address some of the issues to consider if you're developing a program and you have not had an existing victim service program within your tribal community. But again, it's to provide you a template or a tool that speaks directly to an example of what that could look like. And Kelly will be speaking to that tool that we've provided for you. But as you're putting together your full RFP, again, it's about what do we know about victims in our communities and tribes, and how do you know that information? And specifically, how are we addressing the needs? And so again, if it's behavioral health, or if it's ICW, or if it's, within the tribal court system, and we've arrived at what we know about victims based on our own experience, that may not be enough. And it's not to say that your process to arrive at those safety needs for victims is not a completely valid opportunity. Again, this is about understanding the gaps in safety and how we are able to address the capacity needs to arrive wholly at safety for victims. This is the one area where unintended consequences could potentially happen if we are not coordinating with other services within our tribal communities. And so we really want to address those complexities of the needs of victims. And so, some of the tribal communities may not have a confidentiality policy, for example, if they have not had a tribal victim program. So that's maybe one area to begin from. The other is community education, and again, to dispel myths about victims and victim blaming. Maybe there's opportunities if there is a local domestic violence program that is not meeting the needs of victims, what is the opportunity of creating a new victim service program and then potentially building a relationship with that shelter to say that I'm the victim advocate here in the tribal community. We have victims from our tribal community utilizing your shelter services. However, these are maybe specific needs that we are seeing or gaps. And so this is really an opportunity to be as informed as possible. And so how did we arrive at the need for victim services within our tribal communities? And then who have we worked with within our tribal justice systems to really respond to those needs? And if not directly with the victims themselves. And so this is really the opportunity to build from the ground level up, responding to victim-centered needs and services. Next slide. And I'm going to turn it over to Kelly at First Pick.
Yeah, Abby, could you pull up the PDF of the template 1 application while we're talking? Okay, so this shows similar information to what I was going to just talk through, but what you'll see in these PDFs that we've provided is there's a cover page here that just gives you some information about the time and the requirements, some instructions for using the template, and then if you go ahead and scroll down into the template, this is what the online reporting site will look like. And so you'll see exactly how the information might be entered into the system. Again, we've created 3 different templates based on 3 different circumstances. This one is for a tribe that does not have any tribal or victim services at all. for right now, I'll just tell you, for some of these pieces, we're going to be doing a recorded screencast where we'll be kind of clicking through the application and showing you what it looks like to enter some of the information in. But this just shows you some of the level of detail that we're asking for in the application. I wanted to show this just so that it doesn't feel overwhelming in terms of what you're supposed to create. You can see that most of these answers are, you know, a couple of sentences, maybe a paragraph or two, but we're not looking for anything that's, you know, overly explanatory, just looking to understand exactly what you're trying to do. We're going to ask you to outline exactly what support for victim services you're going to provide. There's going to be some questions about if you'd like to participate in technical assistance support. If you keep going, again, we're going to click through each of the pieces in this webcast that we'll send. But, you know, there's maybe 10 to 12 questions depending on what which aspects you're going to apply for. And then at the very end is the section that looks similar to the budget that I'm going to show you. So I just wanted to show this format because this is the format that you're going to be entering your budget in. And if you can go back to that budget real quick. So this is what it's going to look like when you enter the budget in. But if we can go back to the PowerPoint slide, you can see the detailed information a little bit better in this slide. The slide that I'm showing you, this right here, has exactly the same information as the template does. So just to show you, when we said this is a cursory collection of costs at the category level based on your expectations for what you're going to need. You can see for somebody like personnel, we provide a description about the person is hourly, how many hours per year, how many years. We show our calculation. That just makes it faster for the review process. We're able to show what benefits, what fringe benefits are going to be included. For travel, we've broken out the different costs for how we got to the total cost listed under the amount. You can see something like vehicle for equipment and supplies. The first line, vehicle purchase including tags and title, estimated at $40,000. You don't need to go through and do a detailed review of exactly what document or exactly what item, what vehicle you're going to get. But we are asking that you think about things like the fact that there's going to need to be tags and title. And so if you think it's going to be X vehicle and it's $36,000, add $3,000 to $4,000 on top of it so that we can make sure to take care of all of those things. Again, these are all estimates. You see that you haven't had to price out exactly how much the desk is, how much the chair is, but you're giving us an estimate of what those costs might be. Again, as we spoke to before, because we're purchasing cell phones, we're also including cell phone service and again, you can see that while this person is $22 an hour for 2,080 hours per year, that's a full-time staff person. So we're charging 100% of their cell phone service to this grant. Same with the internet service. We're charging 100% of their internet service to this grant. If you have existing internet service or you have existing cell phone service and you want to include this new person into an existing plan, then you would just prorate it based on the number of other employees that you have. If this is the fourth employee coming on, then you would take whatever your existing monthly cost or annual cost is divided by 4 and charge this grant 1/4 of the existing cost. Thinking through things like secure cloud-based data storage that you might need, like a Google Drive or something like that, because while you may be keeping paper documentation, you have to remember that for the purposes of federal grants, you have to maintain documentation for 3 years. And so the easiest way to do that may be through kind of secure cloud-based data coverage. Again, thinking through things like vehicle insurance. Obviously, we're going to need that if we're going to be purchasing a vehicle, or routine vehicle maintenance. We're definitely going to want to do a motor vehicle background check on this individual if they're going to be driving victims around in the car. So, just kind of being creative about if you're thinking about, transporting victims, again, what are all those kinds of auxiliary costs that might come into play, and then giving us an estimate for about how much you think those things might cost. In terms of indirect rate, if you have an indirect rate, then you are able to apply the indirect rate to all of the costs that you've listed. If you are doing any subawards or contracts that are over $25,000, then you're limited to applying the indirect rate to the first $25,000 of the subaward or contract. But again, First Pick can help you with that, so don't worry about it too much right now. But do make sure that you include your indirect rate and your indirect costs into this so that you can be included in the budget. And for right now, we're not going to ask for the documentation to show your negotiated indirect rate, but that will be requested at the point that you create your full budget. So just know that that documentation will be needed later on in the process. Next slide. Lana, did you want to speak to anything in scenario 2?
I think, yeah, just quickly, we're not going to go through at length with the different scenarios now that you know that they are a tool. However, just the considerations within scenario 2 is that this is a tribe that has some existing victim services. And as you read through scenario 2, you'll see within the budget that there are a number of agencies that come together. And so this is an opportunity for the victim services to hire a full-time advocate, as well as a sexual assault coordinator that will be located within the Indian Health Services. And then you see with the interaction in the tribal community, social services. So there's an opportunity to fund ICW and expand on victim services on the reservation. So again, this is really to point out that this is not a new program. This is something that we have in place. However, we're bringing in more tribal systems to respond to the needs of victims. I'll turn it over to you, Kelly.
Great. And Abby, can we go to the next slide? So the only thing that I want to point out here, to the point that Lana was just making, is you'll see at the bottom of the description for personnel, we note that the ICW director is going to be responsible for day-to-day activities. This is an existing position, and she's only going to be doing part of her time on this. So we just note that she's going to dedicate 5% of her time to the grant for 18 months. And so it shows the calculation. What we've then done is we've taken the amount that each of these people are charged, what percentage of their time, and then in fringe benefits, we've just taken the total amount that we're going to be applying to this grant, that $135,915, and we've multiplied it by what our fringe rate is to get the fringe benefits. That is enough for right now. What you need to do, some of you have a fringe benefit rate and you just say, okay, our fringe rate is 22%. We do need the breakout of exactly what makes that up. But you can just take the amount that you've applied for personnel and then associate your fringe rate to it to get the amount that you're charging for the fringe rate. One other thing to note in here is that we put contracts with mental health and substance abuse counselors, $20,000. Again, that might end up being subawards to our conversation earlier. But again, at this level, we don't necessarily know who that's going to be. We don't know if they're going to be multiple individuals or one individual. So just kind of an estimate for what you think you're going to be doing on that case. And then to the point that I was making before about the emergency victim needs, such as clothing, personal hygiene products, etc., we put in here an estimate of $150 per person for 300 people for a total of $45,000. That may be an overestimate, but just something basic. How much money do you think, again, court filing fees, transportation costs, emergency needs, what is it going to take up? And about how many people do you think you'll serve in order to get to that total? We can go to the next slide. Well, I'll let you speak through the difference in scenario 3.
Sure. So we wanted to provide at least 3 samples of tribal victim services programming, and specifically to speak to those tribes who are providing through this NCAI microgrant new programming, as well as existing, but also expanding. And so this is an example of a tribal program that really has many systems in place for victim services. And I put in here a 638 tribe because perhaps it speaks to the training needs, as well as working with a federal jurisdiction, and then also healthcare provided by IHS, which many of our tribal communities have, and understanding that currently this program or services within scenario 3 has a number of responses to victim needs, including maybe a victim advocate, behavioral health, crisis intervention, domestic violence, sexual assault, social services such as WIC or EBT or food stamps. However, what this existing fictitious tribe experienced is that they've seen an uptick of elder victims of either financial abuse, domestic violence, and or taking medications from the elders who need them for health issues, and as a result of the recent COVID-19. And so what the tribe has discovered is that they do not have the capacity to meet the needs of the elders in the community. And so this is the opportunity for the tribe to develop a strategic plan through this NCAI microgrant to understand the needs of elders, but also what is the capacity that they have to respond to elders? How are we looking at providing victim advocacy if many of the elders are living within their children's homes or grandchildren's homes, or many of the perpetrators for financial or medication, taking their medication and or elder abuse are their grandchildren? How are we pulling in other systems to really respond to those needs of elders in our community? And so this is an example of expanding an existing victim services program, but within a new population. I'll turn it back over to Kelly.
Great, next slide. So again, this is pretty much the same. The thing that I want to point out on this that's different is if you look under the fringe benefits, we've actually added a health benefit for some of the individuals here. Because that's not necessarily a percentage benefit, we've broken it out based on the estimated cost per month times the number of months that the individual will be employed. I also wanted to note that somebody like the elder victim advocate is going to be hired upon completion of the strategic plan. So we estimate that this individual will only be hired for 12 months because we assume that the first 6 to 9 months will be completing the strategic plan. So again, making sure that we're just thinking about how long, as well as what their rate is and how many hours per week that they're working. Do they need to be part of the grant for the entirety, or they need to be only part of the grant? The other thing that we wanted to speak to is that that I didn't talk about before, for travel, in these instances, I've included that this is a vehicle that is owned by the organization. So you're purchasing gasoline for the vehicle, as opposed to if somebody was using a personal vehicle, at which point you would provide the federal reimbursement mileage rate. But again, we can kind of speak to that a little bit more as we go forward. Next slide. So the next set of slides are actually screenshots of the online reporting system. I'm going to give you some basic information, but like I said, we're going to be doing a screencast video that we'll be sending out. It'll be super short, 10 minutes maybe, that just shows you how to enter your information into the system. This is going to be your login page. You should have received an email with asking you to set up a password. Your username should be your email address, and then you should have set up your password. If you have not received that information, please reach out to the microgrants at ncai.org. If you forget your password, again, you can click the button at the bottom that says forget your password. Next slide. When you go to the front page, there'll be a little sign that says Stage 2 application, click here. You can click on the word here, and that'll take you to your application. Next slide. This just shows you the details of how this is going to be used. One of the things to note is that the application is not editable once you've submitted it. However, you can save. You see the save button in the top right-hand corner. It's also at the bottom, and as well as the submit button. You can save it as many times as you want. You can leave and come back, but once you've submitted, you'd have to reach out to us if you found that there was an error that you wanted to fix. You'd have to reach out to the microgrants@ncai.org to request for it to be opened back up for you. You can access technical assistance resources at the hyperlink where it says here. That will take you back to the page on the external website that has some of the materials for technical assistance. But you can find under use of funds this highlighted word cost. That does have the full list of allowable and unallowable costs that Lana showed earlier in the slide deck. So you do have direct access to that from this page. Go ahead and next slide. This information right here is going to be automatically entered based on what you submitted in your statement of interest. However, if there's any information that needs to be updated, you can change it. The only thing that you can't change is the name of your organization, your DUNS number, and the contact information of the individual submitting. You'll see if you do need to make changes to that, we've provided a link to click there, and it will give you an option to be able to email us to ask for that to be changed. Next slide. Here we just ask you to note whether or not you have authority to apply for the grant on behalf of your tribal nation. Again, you saw this next question on the other, but if you're submitting as a consortium or designee, if you can provide information about the tribal nations that you represent. To Esther's point earlier in the webinar, I believe it was Esther, if you're applying as a consortium or a designee, you will be required to submit documentation showing that your organization has the authority to apply for federal funding on the tribe's behalf. If you have it now, you're going to be able to upload it here under Upload Attachments. If you don't have it yet, you can still submit it without the attachment, but you will need to have it before you receive your letter of agreement. So if you have it now, it's easiest just to upload it, but if you can't get it in time, then know that you still have some time to get that. Next slide. All right, so this looks a little bit similar to what those templates were. This is just where you're going to enter the information for each question. The red stars means that the information is required. Under needs assessment where it says yes, no, if you're not doing a needs assessment, leave that as no, and then these questions will not even appear. If you are going to do a needs assessment, you click yes, and then it expands so that you see these questions. So originally you will not see them unless you click over to yes. Next slide. Same with strategic planning. You will not see this. It will say no, you will not see any questions, but if you click yes, then you will be able to open these. You only have to fill these out if you are planning to apply for funding in order to support strategic planning or needs assessments. If you click no on this, that that's not going to be part of your program, then you're not required to answer these questions. Next slide. This section is required regardless of what you are going to be applying for. You just need to look through this list and check off as many of these as your program is going to provide services for. If there's anything that you plan to provide services for that's not in this list, go ahead and click Other and enter it in. And then we're going to ask you a couple questions about the proposed use of funding. Again, you can look at the templates to see the types of sample answers that we've provided based on the various scenarios that have been outlined. Next slide. Equipment and supplies, this again is not going to be viewable unless you click yes, and then it's going to ask you for some information about how the equipment and supplies are going to be used. Capabilities and competencies is required for every applicant. We went through a little bit of what those questions were at the beginning of the presentation, so I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. And then the budget, I spoke to a little bit about what was being included in the budget. A couple other things in here is once you enter all of your amounts, you can click Calculate Total, and it will give you an amount. If you see at the very top, it's in very small print. That we anticipate that most of the awards are going to be between $25,000 and $250,000. If your project's total is going to be more than $250,000, then if it calculates to more than $250,000, there will be a space asking you to explain why more than $250,000 was needed. So you don't see that right now since we have a zero, but that will show up if that's what the calculation comes out to. Next slide. You have to acknowledge that if you're awarded, that you're going to be required to comply with all the applicable federal and financial management policies and regulations. And then we're planning to do the letters of agreement electronically. So we're asking that you enter the information of the individual who serves as the signatory for legal documentation for your organization. If it's the same, if you are the person who can legally sign documents, then go ahead and re-enter your information here. But if it is somebody else, go ahead and enter their information here. That way we can make sure that they receive the document at the point that is to be signed. If you cannot do electronic signatures, either for technological reasons or because your bylaws do not allow it, you still need to fill out the name of the person who's the signatory, but you can click on this box to request an alternative method of receiving your letter of agreement, and we'll work with you on that. Again, save, you can go away, you can log out, you can log back in as many times as you want, but then once you hit submit, you will not be able to edit unless you email us at microgrants@ncai.org and request us to reopen your application. Next slide. Lana or Esther, I'm not sure who wants to.
Thank you, Kelly. This is Lana. So I think I just want to thank all of the participants for their patience and kind of going through the program development and application process. We really thought that this was imperative and important for you as you're putting together your plan to consider the budget needs as well as the safety needs of victims, and really arriving at a place where you feel prepared to put together step 2 of the application if you have not already begun. There are additional resources for you, and it's at our website, tribalvictimservices.org, as well as we have upcoming webinars. Next slide. So the next webinar for step 2 of the application will be implementation. And we're really talking through some of the specifics as we move into implementation, such as the post-award, other additional training opportunities around budget development. And so as we're considering all of the implementation needs, I would encourage you to join us on August 4th for the implementation, as well as September 3rd for the budget development, and then looking forward to the post-award once you're in that post-award period to the financial online reporting webinar. And as Kelly mentioned, she had gone over some of the reporting requirements that will be required, but we have technical assistance provided every step of the way. So I would just encourage, if you have any additional questions, to contact myself on anything to do with victim services, program development, if there are specific questions to putting together a budget, putting together procurement, putting together any other specific financial capabilities or capacities, please contact Kelly and we'll provide our email addresses at the end. But I'm going to turn it over to Esther right now.
Great, thank you so much, Kelly and Lana. And if you want to go ahead and just jump forward to the contact information page so we can have on everyone's screens. Thank you. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them now. There's a questions box in your control panel. You can also raise your hand and we can unmute your lines. You can ask your question verbally. We don't have any questions at the moment, so I'll just say a few last words. I want to give a really special thank you to both Kelly and Lana and First Pick and TLPI respectively in putting this together. We are, NCAI Fund is excited to be able to work with tribes and be able to get this funding where it needs to go. We know that there is a need in Indian country and a shortage for victim services. And so, we're glad to take on this opportunity and be able to get this funding out to your communities. And a special thank you to TLPI and First Pick for really helping make this successful. So please feel free to reach out to us in the future, here's our contact information. Please visit our website. And again, you can email microgrants@ncai.org with any additional questions. And then finally, just a reminder, there are some handouts available for download, and both the handouts and the recording of the webinar will be available online at tribalvictimservices.org. And with that, I don't see any other questions. So thank you all again for joining, and we will hopefully talk to you again on August 4th.